Russia has built more tanks than any other country on Earth. Not by a little, by a lot. And many of those machines changed the way wars were fought forever. Some were terrifying, some were total failures, and some looked so strange that you would think they came from a dream. This is the full story. Every single tank, from the very first rusty experiments over 100 years ago, all the way to the monsters Russia is building right now. Let us go back to the very beginning. It is 1914. World War I has just started. Russia is a massive empire, powerful on paper, but struggling to keep up with modern technology. Soldiers are dying by the thousands in muddy trenches, with no way to break through enemy lines. So engineers start thinking, what if we build a machine that can do what soldiers cannot? The first attempt was called the Vezdekad. The name basically means go anywhere. It used a single wide rubber track running under the whole vehicle, with two small wheels at the front for steering. On paper it sounded smart. In real life, it never left the testing ground. It was too weak and too slow to be useful. Then came something even wilder, the Tsar tank. This thing looked absolutely nothing like a tank. It had two front wheels that were nearly 9 meters tall, almost as tall as a 3-story building. The idea was that those giant wheels would crush anything in their path, walls, trenches, fences, anything. But during the very first test, the small rear wheel sank straight into the soft ground, and the whole machine just sat there. It never moved again. The project was shut down, and the rusting frame stayed in that field for years. There was also the Mendeleev tank, a design so ahead of its time that most people did not even take it seriously. It was basically a giant armored box with a massive naval gun on top. The armor was so thick that the whole machine was incredibly heavy. To even move it from place to place, engineers planned to put it on special railway wheels. It never got built, but it showed that Russian engineers were already thinking big. World War I ended. The Russian Empire collapsed. A revolution happened, and the new Soviet government took power. They inherited a broken country with almost no modern weapons industry. But they had a goal: build a real military, build real tanks. Their first attempt at making their own tank was basically just copying a French design called the Renault FT. They called their copy the Russki Renault. It was not original, but it proved something very important. The Soviet factories could actually build complex machines. That was the starting point. Everything that came after grew from that moment. With the basics proven, Soviet engineers stopped copying and started creating. The 1930s were a wild time for tank design. Nobody really knew what the perfect tank looked like yet, so everyone was experimenting, trying crazy ideas, testing limits, and sometimes failing spectacularly. The first real Soviet tank was a small machine called the MS-1. It was tiny, slow, and not very powerful, but it was theirs. Thousands of young soldiers trained on it and learned how tanks actually work. Without the MS-1, there's no Soviet tank army. It was the foundation. Then came the first attempts at medium tanks, the T-12 and the T-24. These were bigger, carried more weapons, and looked more like what we imagine tanks to be. But they broke down constantly. Engines failed. Parts cracked. Only a small number were ever finished. Still, the engineers learned from every single mistake. Around the same time, the Soviets looked at a tiny British vehicle and thought they could use it. They copied the design, made their own version, and called it the T-27. It was barely big enough for two men sitting side by side. No rotating turret, very thin armor, and extremely cramped. But it was cheap and simple to produce in large numbers, and the Soviet army needed numbers more than anything else at that point. Then came a tank that actually worked well, the T-26. Based on another British design, this light tank became the main weapon of Soviet armor through the entire 1930s. It fought in Spain during the Civil War there. It fought in the Far East against Japan. By the time World War II started, it was already a combat veteran. Not perfect, but reliable and effective. Speed became the next obsession. Soviet engineers got hold of an American design from an inventor named Christie. His suspension system allowed tanks to move incredibly fast. The Soviets built the BT-2 around this idea, and then improved it into the BT-5. These tanks could literally remove their tracks and drive on their wheels alone on smooth roads, reaching speeds that no other tank in the world could match at the time. The BT-5 carried a 45mm gun that could destroy almost any enemy tank it faced. It was fast, it was armed, and enemy commanders were not happy about it. Water was the next challenge. The Soviets built the T-37A, the first tank in history to be mass-produced that could actually swim. It had a small propeller at the back and a rudder for steering. Scouts could now cross rivers and lakes without needing bridges. For Eastern Europe, where rivers and swamps cover huge areas, this was a massive advantage. But some engineers went too far in the other direction. Instead of making tanks faster and lighter, they started stacking turrets on top of each other. The T-28 had 3 turrets. The T-35 had 5. 5 turrets on one tank. It looked unstoppable on paper and in parades. In actual combat, it was a disaster. Slow, complicated, and constantly breaking down. The lessons were piling up fast. And something much greater was coming. June 1941. Germany invades the Soviet Union. Millions of soldiers clash across thousands of kilometers. It becomes the largest land battle in human history. And tanks are right in the middle of all of it. The Soviets had numbers on their side, but were caught completely off guard. Factories were overrun. Entire armies were surrounded. The situation was desperate. Engineers had no time for experiments anymore. Every tank that rolled off a production line went straight to the front. The KV-1 was one of the first real shocks of the war, but for the Germans, when they first encountered it, their standard anti-tank guns did almost nothing to it. Shells bounced right off. German soldiers reported surrounding single KV-1 tanks and hitting them dozens of times with no result. It was practically invincible in those early months. It bought the Soviet army precious time. The KV-2 was even more extreme. It carried a 152mm gun, the kind of weapon normally found on ships and artillery positions. One shot from that gun could completely destroy any vehicle on the battlefield. The problem was it moved like a slow giant, and the huge turret could only rotate on flat ground. But when it worked, nothing could survive it. For lighter and faster needs, the Soviets built the T-60, a small scout tank made from truck parts because proper materials were running out. Simple, quick to build, and kept the army moving during the darkest months of 1941. But the real star of the entire war, and honestly one of the most important machines in military history, was the T-34, sloped armor that made shells slide off instead of punch through, wide tracks that handled mud and snow better than anything Germany had, a powerful gun, and an engine that actually worked in brutal Russian winters. The T-34 did not just win battles. It forced Germany to completely redesign their tanks just to compete with it. By the final years of the war, the Soviets introduced the IS-2. Armed with a 122mm gun, it could destroy a German Tiger tank from over a kilometer away. When Soviet forces pushed toward Berlin in 1945, IS-2 tanks led the charge through the streets. The war was won, and Soviet engineers already had new ideas. The war ended, but the competition did not. Now the Soviet Union was facing a completely different enemy. NATO, the United States, Western Europe. No bullets were flying yet, but both sides were building weapons as fast as humanly possible. And tanks were at the center of everything. The first big Cold War tank was the T-54. It had a powerful 100mm gun, tough rounded turret, and was simple enough to produce in massive numbers. The Soviets built so many of them that they are still being found in active service in various corners of the world today. Nothing before it had been produced on that scale. Then came the strange experiments. Object 279 is probably the most unusual tank ever seriously proposed by anyone. It had 4 tracks instead of 2, spread wide across a flat hull that looked like a flying saucer from a science fiction film. The design was not just for show. It was built specifically to survive the shockwave from a nuclear explosion without flipping over. It could also cross swampy ground that would swallow any normal vehicle. Only one was ever built. The T-62 introduced something that changed tank guns forever: a smoothbore barrel. Traditional guns had spiral grooves inside to spin the shell. The T-62 fired shells without any spin at extremely high velocity. This design became the global standard for modern tanks. Then came the T-64. This was a genuine leap forward. Composite armor mixing different materials together to stop shells more effectively than plain steel. An automatic loader replacing one crew member entirely. A smaller, harder-to-hit profile. Western intelligence agencies were seriously alarmed when they first learned about it. The T-72 came next, designed to be simpler and cheaper than the T-64 while still being genuinely dangerous. It became one of the most widely exported tanks in history, ending up in armies across the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Closing out the Cold War was the T-80, powered by a gas turbine engine, the same type used in helicopters. It was incredibly fast and could start instantly in temperatures that would freeze conventional engines solid. It was the most advanced Soviet tank ever built at that point. Then the Soviet Union collapsed, and everything changed again. 1991, the Soviet Union is gone. Russia inherits the military, but loses the money. Huge tank programs get canceled overnight. Factories close. Engineers who spent their entire careers building the most advanced machines in the world suddenly have no funding and no direction. But Russia does not stop building tanks. It just gets more careful about what it chooses to finish. The T-90 came from combining the proven T-72 hull with the advanced electronics from the T-80. It was not the most revolutionary design, but it worked. It was affordable, and it sold extremely well to other countries. India alone bought hundreds of them. It kept Russian tank production alive during the difficult years. Engineers kept dreaming bigger, though. The Object 640, nicknamed the Black Eagle, was a prototype that stored all its ammunition outside the main crew area, meaning an explosion would not automatically kill everyone inside. It looked aggressive and modern, but never reached production. Then came the T-14 Armata. This is where Russia made its boldest statement in decades. The entire three-man crew sits inside a heavily armored capsule, completely separate from the turret. The turret itself has no crew inside it at all. Every system is operated remotely. If the turret gets destroyed, the crew can still survive. Nothing else in the world works quite like it. The most recent version in active service is the T-90M, featuring upgraded armor and a completely redesigned turret. Right now, it is the most capable tank Russia actually fields in real numbers. From a rubber-tracked experiment that never moved to an unmanned turret with a crew capsule, Russia spent over a century figuring out how to build the perfect tank. That journey is still not finished.